Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, what started out to be a great week for the Orleans Parish Library may have a disturbing chapter amid accusations of misspending of donated funds. We'll take a look at the good news and the worrisome for the library. St. Bernard Parish President David Peralta saw a grand jury throw the book at him this week, and the Mitch Landrieu administration began a new chapter as its second term reached an anniversary. We'll look at these stories tonight, as well as troubles for a biotech company, and our Future Watch segment looks at brace yourself, another round of uptown street construction coming soon. On the page for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. David Hammer, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. And Richard Thompson, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. And we go to Richard first. St. Bernard President Dave Peralta has scored another indictment.
That's right. For the third time in just over a year this week, David Peralta, the parish president of St. Bernard, in his first term, was indicted by another grand jury, this time in Baton Rouge. And he now faces 6 additional charges, 3 counts of perjury because he went in and testified before the grand jury, and also 3 counts of filing false public records. And what it all deals with are a series of campaign finance reports that he's filed in the last few years detailing his spending on campaign donations. And in the Attorney General's office, which is prosecuting the case, claims that on almost 24 occasions over the last few years at 4 Gulf Coast casinos, he's gone in with his ATM card, withdrawn cash from his campaign war chest, and either used that money to gamble and said that he was meeting with campaign advisors and others who were supporting his re-election bid, or just didn't report it at all.
So he didn't deny being in the casinos and having meetings there, but he says they were campaign related, right? He
said all along that they were campaign related, in that if you look at his finance reports for the last couple of years, you'll see a lot of charges for maybe $405.99 or $205.99. And his defense of that has been, look, I went to the ATM, I took out the money, we were at the buffet, and as people came in, I'd pay for them individually. But some of that doesn't add up either, because there are charges he'd listed at the buffet at Harrah's, for instance, but there are others at restaurants like Bogart's and Besh, where maybe that's just not the way you'd go about paying for the meal.
Now, this was also a grand jury in Baton Rouge that handed down this indictment, but he's a St. Bernard Parish president, so why was it in Baton Rouge?
I think they were looking at it in Baton Rouge because that's where the State Ethics Board is headquartered, and that's where these reports are filed. And this, of course, is the 4th grand jury in the last year that's targeted him, with one that's still ongoing, that's met several times over the last few months in St. Bernard.
Now, he's requested that the proceedings really be speeded up, right?
He has requested that they're speeded up. He wants to try to get this behind him in Baton Rouge pretty quickly. And at the same time, next month, he's slated to stand trial on a stalking charge in St. Tammany. So he's got a lot going on in the next few months.
Did he expect to be indicted? I was reading your report. It sounded like they were just standing around, not sure what was going to happen.
He was in there for about 2 hours. He came out, he seemed distracted but upbeat. I think that it's generally, from what I've heard from lawyers and legal observers, it's generally unusual to see someone who's the target of a grand jury go in and actually provide testimony to the jurors. And he did that, and he came out and he kind of wandered around for a little while. He looked out the window, he bantered with reporters, and then about 45 minutes later, the grand jury handed up the indictment.
So, trial set for next month in St. Tammany regarding the stalking charges, which stemmed from the original charges, which came out of a St. Bernard Parish grand jury, state grand jury, regarding sexual assault type of charge.
Sexual battery.
Sexual
that was
battery,
the first.
Yes.
Going
but
back,
that's been dropped.
That's since been dropped, and he's claimed victory at that being dropped. He said that was based on perjured testimony from his now ex-wife, and he's actually filed a federal lawsuit against the AG's office as a result of that. However, the AG's office says that they are close to re-indicting him in a superseding indictment that may or may not include that. They sought to push that trial date back. The judge denied that request, so they said, let's just scrap it. We'll get you again on this next one.
So the grand jury in St. Bernard Parish, though, is still meeting, considering other charges. Is that correct?
They're still meeting. They're considering other charges. They may include that initial sexual battery charge. They're also presenting evidence that includes witness intimidation and obstruction of justice and malfeasance in office.
Mr. Peralta is up for re-election this fall, is he not? Is he planning to seek re-election with all of this going on?
He said as recently as this week he's planning to seek re-election. He's dismissed calls from residents and other officials to resign, and he says he's looking forward to it.
So residents have called for him to resign. I mean, how do people in St. Bernard feel about all of this going on, about their president? And is he able to get any work done?
I think at this point, you know, a lot of officials, initially after that first indictment, they called on him to resign very publicly. He refused. And now it just seems like they've kind of given up and they're just going to let either the courts decide or the ballots decide in the fall. He, for the time being, has a firm grip on the job because according to the parish charter, he's actually going to be convicted in order to be forced to resign. And so that's why there could be a lot of attention to this stalking case if it goes to trial next month, because that could be the state's lone chance at trying to convict him while he's still in office.
It's interesting because the St. Bernard presidency has been so tinged with issues here just constantly, because as soon as Peralta took office, there was this raid on Craig Tafaro's storage unit where he apparently had some public records.
Former St. Bernard Parish president.
The previous St. Bernard Parish president. And that was right out there in the open, and then it died down, and then it starts in on Peralta.
But there were a lot of questions with that raid about who it was that had called it and who was behind it. And there
Right.
was
That's what I
blood
mean.
stemming from between Tafaro and Peralta, because Peralta was Tafaro's CAO. He fired him. Then Peralta ran against him not long after and beat him.
Right.
And Mr. Peralta, of course, maintains his innocence and says all of this is really politically motivated.
All of it's politically motivated across the board. He's looking to plead not guilty.
All right, Richard, thank you. Okay, questionable use of funds according to this latest indictment against Mr. Peralta. Now, you had a story about questionable use of funds also regarding the New Orleans Library Foundation and people involved with it, including a very famous musician here in New Orleans.
That's right. Grammy winner Irvin Mayfield. He was the, well, I should make a distinction here between the public library system and the public library foundation. Mayfield was appointed the head of the library system, or the chairman of the library board, which is a public city board, by former Mayor Ray Nagin after Hurricane Katrina. And he then joined the Public Library Foundation, which is a support foundation that receives private donations from the general public.
Not taxpayer dollars.
Correct,
going
not
to
taxpayer dollars. So at any rate, he was then, what I found was in 2012, that foundation's mission changed tremendously. And a vote of a 5-member board, which included Mayfield and his employee from the New Orleans Jazz Orchestra, Ronald Markham, voted to change the mission of the foundation beyond just the public libraries. And after giving, $500,000 or $600,000 or $800,000 to the public library system every year, they started at that point giving more like $100,000 to the public library system. And in that very first year, 2012, they gave $666,000 to the New Orleans Jazz Orchestra that pays Irvin Mayfield and Ronald Markham's salaries.
Tell us more about the New Orleans Jazz Orchestra. Is it too a 501c3 nonprofit organization?
It is a 501c3, and the chairman at the time was Ron Foreman, who is the head of the Audubon Institute, and his son, Dan Foreman, was on the Library Foundation board. So there's all kinds of connections from one board to the other. Then you have Irvin Mayfield, of course, is the founder of the Jazz Orchestra and on their board. So he's on the giving board and the receiving board. And then, like I said, he's making that year $148,000 in salary, and his production company was hired for concert productions at $109,000. So the real question here is, first of all, apparent conflict of interest. Giving board, receiving board, same people, and receiving salary. Then the question is, how was the money used? Was it used on what its intended purposes were? Did the board, the rest of the board members on the Library Foundation, really understand how much they were giving and what they were giving? And another key part of this that I found was there was a resolution in mid-2012 at the same time that they were changing the mission to give Mr. Mayfield a great deal of discretion over how money would be spent by the Library Foundation.
Now, this is the New Orleans Public Library Foundation. It is separate from the New Orleans Public Library System, but obviously it's very close to the New Orleans Public Library System. It exists because of the New Orleans Public Library System. So the members then of the library system, which is taxpayer funded.
Correct.
Were they aware of these changes happening to the mission statement, to the bylaws, the guidelines of the foundation?
Well, the chairman of the library board said that he was not aware just how much it had changed. He was saying, well, you know, we ask for a certain amount of money and they're there to support us and they've been supportive of us. But he didn't realize that they were giving all this 6 times as much money in a given year to Mayfield's Jazz Orchestra as opposed to the libraries. The director of the libraries, which is a paid position, a city position, is Charles Brown, and he was hired in 2012 to run the system, and he was actually hired by the foundation initially as a consultant, and that raised some concerns after that came out back in 2012. And he says that he knew that the mission had kind of widened and that he was supportive of that, but he said he didn't realize how much money was going directly into Mayfield and Markham's pockets, and he's concerned about that.
And so the foundation, Mayfield and Markham, at any rate, on both boards, how are they justifying this? What are they saying about it?
They're saying it went into this jazz market, the New Orleans Jazz Market, the People's Health New Orleans Jazz Market that just opened last month on Aretha Castle Haley in Central City. And this is an area that doesn't have a lot of library services. You know, you have to go to Broadmoor or uptown to get to a library, or downtown. And this is an area that really needs services. And so doing it through jazz and getting youth involved in jazz is a literacy program of sorts, and they say that they have some library collections of jazz records, and they're going to try to develop more access to library services through Wi-Fi and computers that they plan to install in this new facility.
How close was Nagin with Mayfield?
Well, it appears that he was very close, because in 2003 he named Mayfield the cultural ambassador of the city of New Orleans, and at that point Mayfield was only about 26 years old. So it was kind of a surprising thing out of the blue, and then he then named him the head of the chairman of the library board, the city board. And
did he have any experience with libraries at that time?
You know, he said that he was a big supporter of libraries, but he didn't have like any library science experience, and it very controversially replaced a lot of certified librarians with non-librarians to run the system.
So in following up on your reporting then, will there be more investigations, not necessarily by you, but by other entities?
Well, I'm continuing to look into it, and yes, there are other entities investigating. We don't know how quickly that will move, but there's some, you know, the former head of the Library Foundation and library boards called on them to return the money, the Jazz Orchestra, and that's something they're going to have to consider very shortly.
Now, you guys reported this week, and this comes a week, the week after this past weekend's elections, regarding the millage, the tax for the libraries. First, I want to find out from you why you waited, and then we're going to go over to Errol to talk about this tax that did pass.
Yes, the decision was made at WWL to wait until after the election. There's kind of a tradition, whether it's the FBI investigating malfeasance or corruption by elected officials right before an election, they won't come out with anything. There's just a general idea that when you're right up on an election that you are not going to try to influence the election. But most importantly was the distinction between the money. The money was private donations, not money for the city to run the libraries. And the tax millage question was involving that. Here we're talking about a couple $100,000 of private donations versus the millions of dollars in taxpayer money that they were asking for to try to keep the lights on and pay for the services at the library.
And expand services. Okay, to Errol now. Let's talk about that tax.
Well, the week started out as a great week for the library, okay? But and actually this millage election made history. It's probably the first election ever where Elton John may have been a factor in the outcome of the election. People knew it was going to be a low turnout election, but people didn't know how high turnout the Jazz Fest was going to be, and so that probably took some voters away. But say, even with a high turnout election, I think this library millage was a pass. I mean, the margin was 75 to 25%, which is a substantial victory. It's a great victory. It was really a meaningful victory because since Katrina, people in New Orleans have not voted to tax themselves for anything. They do a renewal or something like that, but to actually tax themselves. And so it was very symbolic and then a very important victory, and a victory that the library system had a right to feel proud about it. They had like about $8 million into the coffers. They can open new libraries and really get things going. And so it was a significant to the library, and I think to the political leadership that I think knew the right strategy, how you play a millage election. You go to a low turnout election, you keep it quiet, you get the chronic voters out there, and it passes. On the same ballot was the sheriff's millage proposal. It wasn't a renewal, it was to prevent it from decreasing, and it passed too. And so Marlon Guzman, for all the controversy he's had in the last couple of years, he won re-election and he got a millage passed, and so that's fairly good too. And so it was significant. It was a significant election in that way, and I think the library system would be feeling good about itself had it not been for the other turn of events this week.
So the library system will be getting some additional
it
cash
will,
to expand.
Yeah, this is all independent of all of this. Yeah.
Okay, Errol, thanks a lot. Okay, Don, Future Watch, more construction already. You can't figure out how to get around uptown.
Well, I personally got stuck. I drive around uptown a lot, and I personally got stuck twice in the last week where things just weren't marked well, and a path that I had been able to take just the week before was no longer available and open, and it's really getting ready to get
a guessing game.
A lot worse. I think it was about this time last year when we all celebrated that the St. Charles Avenue streetcar line was once again open and running, and it was whoop-de-doo, la-di-da. Well, guess what? It's closing again.
Long, yeah.
Not for long. Starting June 1st, it's supposed to be 90 days worth of construction where the streetcar tracks are going to be ripped up at these three interchanges: St. Charles and Jefferson, St. Charles and Louisiana, and St. Charles and Napoleon. And all this is part of the Southeast Louisiana Flood Prevention Strategy work going on through the Army Corps of Engineers, where they're putting in, I think Errol loves to hear this, these big box culverts underneath, and they're big tunnels, basically 10 by 14 that could fit a bus through them. And the purpose of them is for drainage. And to understand it even better, instead of water sitting in people's yards and on the streets and waiting to be pumped out, it can sit underground. It can sit in these tunnels and fill up these tunnels and ultimately be pumped to the lake after a storm. And it's supposed to prevent things like we saw with the famous May flood, May 3rd flood. And, so it's for the good, but what it means is that all of the streetcar tracks at those intersections will be closed, and traffic up and down St. Charles Avenue, while it will still be open, will be diverted in certain places where you're going to go across the streetcar tracks and go the wrong way, what feels like the wrong way, and then go back across. Jefferson Avenue will be only one lane northbound from St. Charles Avenue and may, in fact, close for part of this construction project. Napoleon and Louisiana will both only be one lane in each direction. So your best bet, unfortunately, is going to be to avoid uptown if you can. If you can't,
well, merchants don't want to hear that.
All the cross streets that you used to take, you just are going to have a whole lot of patience. They're doing it now. One of the reasons they're doing it now, or starting June 1st, is once carpools and schools out, a lot of that uptown traffic kind of mysteriously goes away. When people aren't waiting in lines on Jefferson to pick up at Newman, for instance, that traffic goes away. The streetcar tracks then are going to have to be relayed and put back historically correct because it's a National Historic Monument. So it's a lot of work. Claiborne is still part of it. Claiborne should be finished and reopened first, and the whole project should be finished by 2017. So It sounds way off, but this should be the last major headache of this project.
So, go ahead, Errol.
As you referred to, this past week would have been the anniversary of the famous May 3rd flood, which I think was in '78. It was Dutch Moriel's first full day on the job. He was inaugurated one day, the next day the city floods. But that was the day that the city realized the problem it had, because so much of the city had been concreted now, like with the Superdome, and there was less drainage, and the people began to realize, we got a problem now. And still, all these years later, they're still resolving the problem.
Right, and 20 years ago today, May 8th flood, which was a significant flood for the
Right.
city as well. So streetcar service will be disrupted?
It will be disrupted between Arado and State Street, or State and Arado, depending which direction you're going, and the RTA will be running shuttle buses at those points.
Okay.
So it'll still run the full either end on either side of that, but between those 2 points, you'll have to take a bus.
All right, June 1st is when that extra
kicks off.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dawn. Richard, you wrote a couple of pieces about a new enterprise here in the city that was really highly lauded and touted, but it's having some problems, and this is in the biomed field. Can you explain to us what to write?
It was just a year ago that state and city officials were really trumpeting Renaissance RX as one of these kind of post-Katrina standouts, a local homegrown biotech firm that they thought could really be maybe one of many that could eventually help diversify the local economy. And it's been a real tough year for them. It was only last September the state had announced a pretty lucrative incentive-based deal with them. They were going to open a new headquarters on St. Charles Avenue, and their workforce was expected to swell by hundreds, both here and nationally. And in just the last few months, that's really changed. What they set out to do is they performed DNA testing to try to help doctors tailor medicines for their patients. And so their main thing was they have this one study that involves a 250,000 patient registry in which doctors would refer their patients to this if they were on multiple medications. They could undergo this testing and be able to see if these medicines would have adverse reactions from each other. But as part of that, it was Medicare was going to pay for the study. That was their main supplier on it. But in the last few months, what we've found is that their Medicare billings had jumped dramatically from about $3 million in 2013 to over $120 million a year later.
That would raise a red flag.
It raised a red flag at a point where the Obama administration is really trying to weed out any potential Medicare fraud, which costs the federal government hundreds of millions of dollars a year. So in turn, they launched a review, they froze their funding, and it's led to widespread layoffs throughout the company and scuttled the plans to move over to St. Charles Avenue.
And a doctor who was involved with them is now suing them for back wages and such, and he made claims that maybe kind of prompted this Medicare investigation. Is that right?
He's probably one of hundreds of doctors across the country who are involved in this to refer patients to it, and he, from Rhode Island, has filed this lawsuit essentially claiming that Renaissance embedded a clinician in his practice who would basically just try to encourage them to take as many of these tests as possible, whether they were applicable or not, and then we're gaming the billings with Medicare so that they would pay for them.
And so these tests, which were swabbing cheeks, right, and those were supposed to be done with patients who were having problems with their medications, sort of conflicting or contraindications with medications, but they were being done, as this man alleges, on people who were not having any problems.
Right. Medicare was willing to pick up the tab for folks who are having conflicting medications, and what he's alleging in this lawsuit is that they were changing the billing codes to show that was happening with everybody, which is fairly rare in itself, and so that's how they were able to jump up the billing so quickly.
When is this fraud investigation going to wrap up?
They were expecting it to wrap up, according to internal emails with the state, sometime this month, so we should have a resolution on it pretty soon.
Is the business going to be able to survive?
That's a lot of people are waiting just to see whether or not it's able to just make it out of this and kind of what the resolution will be.
Okay, Richard, thanks a lot. Errol, Mayor Landrieu, Mitch Landrieu, second term, going into a second year.
Second term, first year down. I think he remains a popular mayor. He cuts a good figure in the community. The administration, as far as I know, has been scandal-free. It's been a progressive administration. Like all Landrieux, he maintained support in the black community and as well as in the white community and the good government community. So I think he's had a lot of good things going for him. To me, I think the one big surprise during this past year was the fallout with Chief Surpass. that when he first came into office, you saw the two of these men who knew each other for a long time. And when he first appointed Chief Surpass, he was appointed, comparing him to Drew Brees. We got the Drew Brees of police chiefs. And then what happened, and then it's been intensified during this past week with some reports that Channel 4 has been doing on emails that Chief Surpass has had, complaining that he saw problems and that nobody in the administration was listening to him. Of course, that comes down to an economics issue. You got these demands on one side, and then you have to disperse the money on the other side. So that's probably been, I would imagine, probably the biggest personal disappointment in the Landry administration. But he's gone into the last 3 years. It's not a contentious administration. There's not the ugliness that there was between the mayor and the city council, certainly in the Ray Nagin days. There's a flare up every so often. But the city, at least from City Hall, is pretty much at peace right now. And I guess within the next year, the politics is going to start intensifying for the next mayor's election. And we know that the mayor said he's not going to run for governor, and the nature of politics in Louisiana doesn't favor a Democrat from New Orleans, and so his best course would probably be the hope that a Democrat gets elected nationally and maybe get a cabinet position. His dad, after being mayor, at one point served as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, right. And so his future course may be in Washington more so than Baton Rouge.
Well, certainly a big problem that he has to address, and he is trying to address, is the size of the police force, and then also the issue of crime and how the two relate.
Well, crime is the thing that haunts every mayor, and the size of the police force, and of course, the activists within the police department. As long as I've been following news, the police unions are always angry at the mayor for something. Okay, for not doing enough, and so that's always been there.
All righty, thanks, Errol. All right, time to look ahead. Errol, you first.
Today, the Downtown Development District announced a plan to develop the 700 block of Canal Street, where the Astor Crown Plaza Hotel is, at ground level, to try to get some higher-end stores in that area. They have a financier. And right now, what you have is mostly T-shirt shops and fast food places, and they want this to be the first step towards upgrading retail, small shop retail on Canal Street.
All right, Errol, thanks. David?
Well, to piggyback on what Errol was just saying about the Landry administration and the reports on Channel 4, my colleague Mike Perlstein did a long interview with the mayor this week, and it's a really dynamic interview that you can see on WWL-TV Channel 4, and it's WWL-TV.com in its entirety. But I'm going to be looking into some more stuff related to manpower at the NOPD.
Okay, David, thanks. Dawn.
It's more a public service announcement than something coming up, but school is getting ready to be out for summer for everybody, so just keep your eyes out, because kids are going to be in places where you're not expecting them to be.
That's right.
Keep
Thanks,
them
Dawn.
safe.
Richard?
Well, I think in the next few days, Saints fans particularly will be watching to see what happens with any kind of resolution from Ball-Ghazi or Deflategate with the Wells report coming out. And I just think that maybe we should consider giving Tom Brady the benefit of the doubt here.
You think so?
And where are you from?
Boston fan?
I think,
Patriots fan.
Where's your hometown?
they tested 11 balls on one side, 4 on the other. That doesn't seem right.
Take it with a grain of salt there, Richard. Okay, thank you guys for being here. Thank you for joining us. We want to see you next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.